talks about anomie and strain theories. So let's begin by talking about classic anomie and classic strain theories. So Merton develops a theory of social structure and anomie and provides explanations of why crime is concentrated in the lower class urban areas. And he also uses this to explain the higher rate of crime in American society. He builds upon the work of Durkheim, and Durkheim studied suicide as it related to higher rates of anomie. Anomie refers to a normlessness and a lack of social regulation in society. And Durkheim is studying this in regards to suicide because suicide is considered very individual behavior, and he wanted to show that there are forces outside of individuals that can impact even the most individual decisions. Merton took that work and applied the same approach to the condition of modern industrial societies. If you recall, Merton talks about how there are socially approved means of achieving goals and culturally approved goals to have. And essentially, Merton says anomie occurs when there's a disjuncture between the goals and the means. Merton says that American society basically brings this disjuncture about in two ways. One is that we have a strong emphasis on success, okay? And in our culture, we sort of think of the American dream as our goal of success. We don't place the same strong emphasis on socially approved means, okay? So in our culture, we encourage everyone to aspire to high goals. Competitiveness and success are glorified. I would ask each of you to sort of think about whether or not you would consider yourself a competitive person. Worth is often judged by material and monetary success. So we talked about this when we talked about the code of the street, how possession sometimes signals to other people that we have gained, we've earned money and we've earned some level of success. If we overemphasize success, then the norms governing how success is achieved becomes weakened, and we end up with higher crime rates. So sometimes our society focuses on winning at all costs as opposed to winning the right way. This discrepancy between the means and ends is perpetuated by our class system. So this idea of success is sort of sold to everybody at every class level, and we see this really embodied in our educational system. In American culture, we really promote the idea that there is equal opportunity for success. But we know that this is not really true in reality. So we encourage people who are very disadvantaged to hold high expectations, yet we block them off from many means of achieving that. So this doesn't mean that we don't allow people from the lower class to be educated, but think about the differences in schools based on the communities in which those schools are located. So in Massachusetts, for example, if this may still hold true, schools are often funded by property taxes. So therefore, in the communities where the land and the buildings are worth the most, has more money, and yet those communities often have fewer students. So it's more money for fewer students. So what happens then is an anomic condition develops, and these groups are still really sold this idea of success, but then it sort of behooves them to achieve that success by whatever means necessary. So we're familiar with these modes of adaptation. Conformity is the behavior that most of you guys, the mode of adaptation most of you guys have chosen. And innovation is the one where we should see higher rates of crime. This is a group that accepts the cultural goals but does not accept the institutionalized means to achieve them. Cloward expands on Merton's theory and looks at the structural sources of strain. So what causes strain for individuals? And he looks at this specifically in terms of the delinquent subculture with lower class adolescent boys. He also perceives block goals as producing deviance, inducing strain. So rather than gaining material success, strain comes from the inability to gain status and acceptance in a conventional society. So in the society at large, how do we achieve success? We meet society's standards of dress, behavior, education, and the most pervasive standards set for that are the standards of the middle class. And this gets imposed in school, where we learn this at school. We should have good manners, appropriate demeanor. We shouldn't be aggressive. We should pay attention to our grades. We should study and actively participate. And these are ways to gain status and approval. This is usually the behavior that teachers reward. Middle-class teens are raised by middle-class parents who prepare them for these expectations. Unfortunately, lower-class youth cannot always meet these standards, especially if they are not raised by parents who understand these expectations. Their status then can produce some frustration, and the delinquent subcultures are a collective response to that frustration. So what do? They have the opportunity then to gain status by adhering to malicious negative values. Aggression, classroom disruption, disdain for academic achievement. You recall when we were talking about the code of the streets, we talked about how if you can't gain status in conventional ways, you can always gain status by being the guy who can kick the most ass in your community or the best drug dealer. So Ohlin basically argues then that this is a very rational decision made by delinquents. Okay, not rational. Again, we want to remember that people are not completely rational. So Cloward and Ohlin expand on this. They talk about differential opportunities, and they talk about how just like we don't have equal opportunities to legitimate success, there is not equal access to illegitimate opportunities either. Right? Most of us cannot just decide to become a hitman or a drug dealer, or a member of the Latin Kings. We also need access to these illegitimate opportunities, and those are not equally distributed. Basically, people have unequal access to both types of opportunities. It's clear that when people are deprived of legitimate means, this will produce a strain towards delinquent activities. What those delinquent activities look like will depend on what illegal opportunities are available in their neighborhood. We know that racial and ethnic minorities are more likely to be poor, and so we should expect higher rates of delinquency amongst these groups. Cloward and Ohlin talk about several subcultures, and these develop in response to the opportunities available to them. So one type of gang are criminal gangs. They commit income-producing offenses, and this is pretty similar to Merton's mode of adaptation innovation. These are found in lower-class neighborhoods that are organized around stable adult criminal patterns. Here we have organized, successful criminals residing or operating openly, and they provide criminal role models and criminal opportunities. Conflict gangs are fighting gangs. They don't have very many illegal opportunities available to them, so they don't have a lot of successful adult criminal role models, and so status for them is gained through fearlessness and violence. And retreatist gangs are just like the retreatist mode of adaptation. These are people who have given up and retreated into drug and alcohol use. Miller talks about focal concerns. So just like Miller also talks about the middle-class measuring rod. So coming back to that idea that what we expect from people, the acceptable pathway to success, is to follow middle-class values. Well, Miller says that delinquent behavior is an adaptation to lower-class culture. And so what they have is they have their own focal concerns. If you put these in a particular order, they spell out the word latest. So they are focused on things like luck. They don't believe, they basically believe that things are left up to fate. Autonomy, they're really fighting to not be controlled by anybody else. Trouble, how much trouble are you in? How much trouble have you avoided? Toughness, excitement, and smartness. And smartness refers to street smarts, not your GPA. So what does research on this topic tell us on classic theories? Are crime and delinquency concentrated in lower class and minority groups? Well, if we look at official statistics, they are. If we look at self-report studies, it depends which self-report studies we look at. Early initial self-report studies were not really properly developed. Today's self-report studies find very little difference based on class or race. Other researchers have said there is relationship, but it exists in certain conditions. If we compare the most disadvantaged people to all others, then yes. We see these relationships being stronger amongst Blacks, in urban areas, and amongst the lower class youth. But research doesn't clearly and overwhelmingly support this relationship. So in terms of official statistics, yes, we do see crime concentrated amongst poor groups and minority groups, but not when we take into account self-reported offending. So it's possible that the relationship between class-related access to legitimate opportunities and the official crime rate operates differently based on race. So burglary, homicide, and robbery arrest rates in 1957 were related in the expected directions to indicators of economic success for white males, but not amongst Black males. Unemployed folks are also expected to experience the greatest strain of blocked opportunities, and therefore they should be committing more crime than people who are employed. But this has mixed support. What about social structural correlates of crime and crime rates? So correlates means, we talk about correlates of crimes, these are factors related to crime. So correlating crime with social class conforms to the idea that Merton's anomie is a theory of social organization and not individual crime. The proper test then is to determine the social structural correlates of rates of crime. So what's happening in the social structure in communities that is related to crime. Bernard contends that anomie is a structural theory because it doesn't provide direct predictions about individual criminal behavior. We can't verify or falsify it with any individual level tests. We need macro level tests. These, however, find inconsistent results. What about gangs and delinquent subcultures? We know that gang delinquency is concentrated in poor communities and amongst Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. There is, however, considerable doubt as to how closely these gangs fit the classifications that Cloward, and Ohlin have put together. When we think about gangs today, I don't think we think about conflict, criminal, and retreatist gangs. Lower class and non-white gang boys perceive more limited legitimate opportunities, but we don't know if that results from gang membership. It's not really clear. Neither gangs nor other delinquent groups sustain a distinct subculture that promotes values and norms directly contrary to conventional culture. They're more likely to agree in general and neutralize or excuse their behavior. So basically here we're talking about definitions of the law. Researchers have been unable to verify these three delinquent groups that I just mentioned, Cloward and Ohlin's three groups. What about school dropouts and delinquency? School is an important area in which lower class kids are confronted with their inability to live up to conventional standards. So for many lower class poor kids, school is filled with failure and strain and frustration. Some research did find some support for this when they compared official statistics for high school grads versus dropouts. Dropout rates lowered after dropping out, but still higher than the grads. Thornberry found that arrests among school dropouts increased the year after leaving school and remained higher than the arrest rate for high school grads up till age 25. When they control for social class and race, this doesn't seem to change the results. A later study found that dropping out sometimes increases delinquent involvement and sometimes it lowers it. So one thing that matters here that's really important here is the reason somebody dropped out, as well as someone's age, gender, and race. When we control for these other correlates of crime, dropping out of school is no longer a significant predictor. What about perceived discrepancies between our goals and our expectations? So the gap between the goals and the means implies that individuals in these anomic situations may perceive this discrepancy, right? So they may perceive that there's pressure on them to succeed, and they don't have the means to do so. As a result, they experience strain. Strain can be measured by the difference between aspirations and expectations, with the idea being that the greater the discrepancy, the greater the likelihood of law violation. Unfortunately, there's not much empirical support for this. Some researchers question this. Maybe these studies are not correctly measuring strain, and some proposed a better indicator of strain as being the disjuncture between economic goals and educational expectations. The best predictor in this study, however, was just the educational aspirations alone without regard to any expectations. So what did people aspire to? What did they hope to achieve in terms of their education? Agnew argued the disjuncture between aspirations and expectations is an indirect measure. We basically assume that people are dissatisfied that they have certain aspirations and maybe they are unable to achieve those. If we instead measure someone's dissatisfaction with how much money they make, we could see a significant modest relationship to drug use and income-generating crime. So findings do support the idea that possession of money only serves to fuel an appetite for more money, and this may lead to more deviant behavior. Okay, what does contemporary anomie and strain theory talk about? So we know that these theories are seen as pretty weak, and by the 70s they're pretty much rejected. But in the 80s we see these sort of become revived. And one talks about institutional anomie theory and general strain theory. So Merton and Rosenfeld look at institutional anomie theory. The American dream has 4 value orientations. There's a strong achievement orientation. Basically, we have a culture here in the U.S. in which we often value people based on what they have achieved or what they possess. This creates a pressure to achieve at any cost. We're also very individually oriented here in our culture. We encourage people to make it on their own, and we encourage people to be competitive with each other as opposed to being cooperative with each other, helping each other achieve success. We have this universal feature where basically we expect that all members of society should strive for the same success goal, and we have also fetishized money, right? So we look at the accumulation of money as an end in itself. This is often the sole metric of success. Money also sort of has this infinite nature where there's always more to be had, right? So people are generally dissatisfied with the amount of money they're making at all levels of income. So one criticism here is that Merton's concept of social structure is too narrowly focused on the class system. So Messner here expands this to look at other institutions and basically looks at this emphasis on the economy. So Messner talks about the dominance of the economy. We have devalued non-economic institutions. So think about people who have chosen to stay at home and raise their children. They do not enjoy as much status or esteem. We also require that non-economic institutions accommodate the requirements of the economy. Today, life revolves around work. When you think about all the technology we have and how easy it is for people to gain access to their work files or their work email, we sort of expect that people are available all the time. And then these economic norms begin to penetrate non-economic institutions. So education basically is depicted as a commodity. And if you think about it, you guys have said some of these things yourself, or you've heard others say it, where people are sort of treating their college education as a means to an end, as a means to a job, as opposed to valuing the education itself. So basically, as these economic institutions gain more prominence, that weakens social control by non-economic institutions. And crime is a natural outcome of that. So we encourage people to compete and win. Messner later broadened this to say institutional imbalance produces higher crime rates. In an economically dominant society, we should see anomic crimes involving material gain. In politically dominant societies, we should see moral cynicism that invites corruption. And in kinship-dominant societies, we should see extreme moral vigilantism. Research has found some support for this. The effect of poverty on property crime depends on the level of church membership, divorce rates, and percentage of voter participation. Crime rates should be lower when society can buffer its members from market forces, right? So when the economy isn't doing well, do we have social welfare options for people? So homicide is inversely related to the quantity and quality of welfare. And an example of emerging Eastern Bloc countries, the effect of income inequality was lower in societies that provided some protection. And there was support for this regarding homicide in the U.S. for the first half of the last century, but not the second half. Mesner talks about several studies that he found were supportive and some that provide mixed results. The least research aspect of this is the claim of American exceptionalism. This theory is weak and has little empirical evidence. So just in terms of thinking of some things here, American crime rates were generally higher than other societies from the 1930s to the 1980s, and those have declined while other societies have raised or remained stable. The rate of U.S. car theft is lower than the rate of burglary, robbery, personal theft, and assault. We still have the highest homicide rate of industrial nations, and if you think about what's sort of been trending recently, is we've seen quite a bit of school violence. Agnew talks about general strain theory, and I believe that Shariah is presenting on this. Oh no, sorry. She's presenting on the general theory of crime. General strain theory talks about three types of strain: failure to achieve goals, removal of something we positively value, or the introduction of something negative. When we think about goals, if we in particular think about monetary success, that would sort of really fit well with what these theories have been discussing. The removal of something positive, this can be the loss of something or the loss of someone. And the introduction of something negative could be victimization, homelessness. So deviant actions then may become a way of dealing with stress. If we experience these types of strains, and especially if we have an angry reaction to it, we are more likely to cope with that in a deviant fashion. This is a much better theory than Agnew's previous version of strain theory, but it also moves the theory closer to social bonding and social learning. There are some studies that do show a direct link between strain and delinquency, but not all sources of strain are significant. So the following strains are more likely to produce crime. When what has happened to you is seen as unjust, when it's very important, when it happens in a very important part of your life, when it comes in situations where social control has been undermined, and when there's pressure from the individual into criminal or delinquent associations. So essentially, strain operates on us to potentially produce a criminal result through social learning, social control, and our personality. So basically, if we don't have legal, lawful, healthy ways of dealing with our strain, that may reduce levels of social control and foster negative social learning and result in criminal behavior. The role of anger that's discussed here hasn't really received a lot of empirical attention. So probably the issue here is that we need to figure out how we're measuring anger. So a lot of times this is measured as a character trait, whether or not someone is generally seen as angry, as opposed to resulting from the situation. A situational measure of anger is much more appropriate here, because what we're saying is some type of strain occurs, it leads to anger, and that leads to negative criminal coping. Strain may also operate differently for men and women. The types of strain, the way people handle their strain may vary by gender. There are a few studies that look at this. Men and women appear to experience similar amounts of strain. Women are more likely to respond with emotions, and women are better able to downplay the importance of strain, avoid it, or talk to others to cope with it. Most problematic here is the specification that other variables condition or moderate the effects of strain. So social learning and control variables increase crime only when they occur in conjunction with strain. So there is a relationship, for example, between strain and substance abuse, but social learning factors are more important. So what are some policy implications of these more contemporary versions of Anomie and Strain? Merton and Rosenfeld emphasized that enhancing legitimate opportunities is likely to backfire because this might fuel a desire for more monetary gain. So what we need to do is strengthen our non-economic institutions. We need to have pro-family policies such as family leave, flex time, and on-site childcare. We need to loosen the ties between academic performance and future economic prospects. Basically, we need to have ways that people whose strength is not school can still survive economically. We need to limit the cost of crime control through intermediate sanctions and create more social and civic participation. Agnew also identified some prevention programs, with the most promising focusing on family and parent management training. This would advocate for family and school programs to train parents in parenting skills, train kids to reduce the tendency to say or do things that provoke negative reactions from others, increase social support, and increase coping skills. Essentially, restorative justice options would be compatible with this theory. Okay, and that wraps up Anomie and Strain theory. If you have any questions, please let me know.